Hello students, this is Mohammad Kashif Iqbal from Jamia Hamdard, New Delhi. Today we will discuss about the fundamental of absorption, and this fundamental of absorption is the one of the important topic under the biopharmaceutics and pharmacokinetics. Under this fundamental of absorption, we will discuss different learning objectives such as introduction, mechanism of drug absorption, the structure of cell membrane, absorption path that dominates drug absorption, post-absorption processes, and finally we will discuss about the summary of this topic. Students, now we start our topic with the introduction. The process by which a compound penetrates one or more biological membranes to gain entry into the body is called as absorption. There are different routes of administration like oral, transdermal, rectal, intramuscular, subcutaneous, nasal, inhalation, etc. are used for administration of active ingredient inside the body. For a drug to be absorbed, it needs to cross biological barrier to reach the general circulation and or elicit a pharmacological response. Even drugs that are dosed intravenously may need to cross the vascular endothelium to reach the target tissue or distribute into blood cells. Often, multiple membranes are encountered as drug traverses through the absorptive layer and diffuses into the blood stream. Transport across these membranes is a complex process impacted by ionization equilibria, partitioning into and diffusing across a lipophilic membrane and having potential interaction with transporter system, that is influx and or efflux. The therapeutic or pharmacological activity of a systemically administered drug is a function of its intrinsic activity and of the concentration profile that is achieved in the circulation. The intensity and duration of activity depends on the drug concentration profile. The onset of drug action depends on the rate of drug absorption, like in case of intravenously injection. Immediate and usually maximal pharmacological effect is seen, whereas slow onset is seen when a drug is given by the oral route. The intensity of pharmacological effect is normally a function of the concentration of drug achieved in the circulation. Actual pharmacokinetic and pharmacodynamics relationship are often complex, but it is reasonable to generalize that higher circulating drug concentration yield greater effect. The level of circulating drug that is achieved depends on dose, absorption efficiency, metabolism, distribution, and also clearance. The major factor affecting drug distribution volume is its lipophilicity. As lipophilicity increases, so does the ability of the drug to cross biological membranes and move into extravascular environments, particularly into fatty tissue and the central nervous system. Another factor affecting drug distribution is binding of the drugs with the various components of the body and in particular with the plasma proteins. Binding of drugs to plasma protein is dynamic and reversible. Any drug that is bound at a particular time is necessarily confined to the plasma volume and thus cannot participate in extravascular distribution. The last factor which affects the circulating drug levels is clearance. The faster the drug clearance from the circulation due to short half-life or due to rapid and extensive metabolism, lower circulating level is seen. High circulating levels of active drug are seen for those drugs which have low clearance rate. There are a number of factors affecting absorption of drug, like the physicochemical properties of drug, the biological factors, and the factors relating to the formulation development. Students, now we discuss about the different mechanism of drug absorption. Drugs administered by oral route must pass through a number of membranes in order to be absorbed into the systemic circulation. Therefore, it is important to know about the cell membrane. Students, now we will discuss about the brief introduction of cell membrane. The primary structure of the cell membrane is shown in figure. The cell membrane appears to be perforated by water-filled pores of various size, varying from about 4 to 10 Armstrong, most of which are about 7 Armstrong. Probably all major ion water-filled channels penetrate the large proteins assemblies that traverse the membrane. Through these pores pass inorganic ions and small organic molecules. Among the common inorganic ions, because sodium ions are more hydrated than potassium and chloride ions, they are larger and do not pass as freely through the pores as do potassium and chloride. Ion or ion plus water movement can be by diffusion done a chemical concentration gradient. However, movement of ions through the pores can be controlled by counter ion transport or expenditure of intercellular energy adenosine triphosphate, or it is also known as ATP, hydrolysis by so-called ABC transporters. Vascular endothelium appears to have pores at least as large as 40 Armstrong, but these seems to be interstitial passages rather than transmembrane pores. Lipid molecules small enough to pass through the cell membrane pores may do so, but they have a higher probability of entering into the lipid layer since pores constitute less than 1% of the cell surface upon which the drug molecules impinges. From there, these molecules will equilibrate chemically with the interior of the cell. Other proteins may be confined to one or the other surface and not traverse the membrane. Often, proteins on the inner surface proteins are linked to intercellular structure proteins that contribute to cell shape. Students, now we will discuss about the mechanism of drug absorption, means how drug penetrate into the cell membrane or how drug reach into the blood circulation. We have already discussed about the drug administered by the oral route must pass through a number of membranes in order to be absorbed into the systemic circulation. Now, we will discuss about the classification of mechanism of drug absorption that is shown in figure. The mechanism of drug absorption is generally categorized into the three categories, that is transcellular or intracellular transport, second paracellular or intercellular transport, and third one is the vesicular or corpuscular transporter, or it is also known as endocytosis. The transcellular or intracellular transport system is further categorized into the two categories as passive transport and active transport. There are different examples of passive transport as passive diffusion, port transport, ion pair transport, facilitated or carrier mediated. And examples of active transport is primary active transport and secondary active transport. Same, the vesicular or endocytosis is further categorized into the two categories as examples pinocytosis and phagocytosis. Students, now we discuss about the transcellular or intracellular transport system. This type of transport mechanism involves passage of drugs across the GI epithelium and is considered as the most common pathway for the drug transport. It involves three steps. First, passing through the GI epithelial cell membrane, and this GI epithelial cell membrane is a lipoidal membrane which is considered as the crucial barrier for drug absorption. Second, reaching across the intracellular spaces, that is cytosol, and third one is the movement through the lateral or basolateral membrane. And this intracellular transport system is further categorized into the different categories, and first category is the passive transport process. This type of transport process does not require energy to traverse through the lipid bilayer, and this is further classified as first passive diffusion. Passive diffusion or non-ionic diffusion is considered as the major absorption process for more than 90% of drugs. It is the movement of drug molecule from the region of higher concentration to a region of lower concentration. Concentration gradient or electrochemical gradient is considered as the driving force for this process. Movement of drugs across the membranes is a result of the kinetic energy of the molecules due to the fact that it does not require any energy. The process is known as passive diffusion. Students, passive diffusion is expressed by Fick's law of diffusion, which states that the drug molecules diffuse from a region of higher concentration to lower concentration until equilibrium is attained, and rate of diffusion is directly proportional to the concentration gradient across the membrane. The mathematically expressed by the following equation shown in a screen, where dq upon dt represent the rate of drug diffusion, that is amount upon time, and it also shows the rate of appearance of the drug in blood. D represents the diffusion coefficient of the drug through the membrane, area upon time. A represents the surface area of absorbing membrane for diffusion of drug, that is area. K, M upon W represents the partition coefficient of the drug between the lipid membrane and the aqueous GI fluid. It has no unit. Concentration of GIT or CGIT minus C represents the differences in the concentration of drug in the GI fluids and the plasma and is often called as the concentration gradient. H represents the thickness of membrane. Certain characteristic of passive diffusion can be generalized as it is downhill transport, greater the surface area and lesser the thickness of the membrane, and faster the diffusion. Equilibrium is attained when the concentration of either side of the membrane become equal. Greater the membrane upon water partition coefficient of drug, faster the absorption. Students, now we discuss about the second type of passive transport process, that is known as the pore transport. Pore transport is also called as the convective transport, bulk flow or filtration. This transport mechanism is responsible for the transportation of drug molecules via the protein channel into the cell, and it is shown on screen. In the pore transport system, the hydrostatic pressure or the osmotic difference across the membrane constitutes the driving force such that the small solid molecules are transported along with the bulk flow of water through aqueous channels. This water flux is known as solvent drag. For absorption of molecules having low molecular weight less than 100 Daltons, low molecular size, that is smaller than pore diameter, and water soluble drugs, this process of absorption is important. A certain type of protein called transport protein may form an open channel across the lipid membrane of the cell. Very small molecules such as urea, water and sugars are able to rapidly cross the cell membrane through these pores. The rate of absorption via pore transport depends upon the number and size of pores, and the equation is shown on screen, where dC upon dt equal to rate of the absorption, n equal to number of pores, r equal to radius of pores, delta C equal to concentration gradient, eta equal to viscosity of fluid in the pores. Students, now we discuss about the ion pair transport. This mechanism is particularly important for the absorption of drugs such as quaternary ammonium compound and sulfonic acid, which readily ionized under all pH conditions. These compounds have low in water partition coefficient values, yet they are able to penetrate into membrane by making reversible neutral complexes with endogenous ions of GIT like mucins. They form neutral complexes which have both suitable aqueous solubility as well as lipophilicity for passive diffusion. Very common example is propanol, a basic drug which forms an ion pair with oleic acid and is absorbed by the above stated mechanism. Students, now we discuss about the facilitated or carrier mediated transport. The presence of some specialized transport mechanism is suggested by the fact that some polar drugs traverse the cell membrane more easily than anticipated from their concentration gradient and partition coefficient values. And the mechanism of facilitated transport system is shown on screen as figure. This mechanism involves a membrane component called as carrier which binds to the solute molecules reversibly or non-covalently. This complex crosses the membrane and then dissociates to release the solute molecule to other side of membrane. Carrier is then returned to the initial position across the membrane to start the cycle again. Facilitated diffusion is a simple carrier-mediated transport mechanism. The main feature of this transport system is that transport occurs along the concentration gradient. No energy expenditure is involved because driving force is concentration gradient. This process is known as downhill transport process. The transport is saturable and competition occurs between isomers. Facilitated diffusion has been used to explain cellular uptake of sugars and amino acids. A drug carrier is required but no energy is necessary. For example, vitamin B12 transport. An intrinsic factor, also known as IF, a glycoprotein produced by the gastric parietal cells, forms a complex with vitamin B12 which is then transported across the intestinal membrane by a carrier system. Carrier proteins are composed of an uncharged nonpolar outer surface which helps in the movement of the across the lipid membrane. The carrier proteins are not partial for any direction such that they work with the same efficiency on both the sides. This transport system works on a lock and key mechanism as the protein are structure specific. As the process is structure specific, some false nutrients having the similar structure to that of the drug can also be transported. As there are limited site on the carrier protein, so they are subjected to competition between the different agents having similar structure. This process is also capacity limited since the number of carrier is limited. The system gets saturated at higher drug concentration. Mixed order kinetic, also called as the Michaelis-Menten saturation or linear kinetic, is used to describe the capacity limited process. It follows a first order kinetic at subsaturation drug concentration and then follows a zero order at and above saturation levels. Student, now we discuss about the active transport processes. Active transport processes is a transport process in which materials are transported against the concentration gradient, that is, from a region of lower concentration to higher concentration, just reverse to passive transport. It is also known as uphill transport. It uses energy from ATP to pull molecules from extracellular to intracellular sites. It is site-specific transport, that is, it is not present throughout the GIT. A few lipid-insoluble drugs, for example, 5-fluorouracil, that is anti-cancer drug that resemble natural physiologic metabolites, for example, glucose, amino acids, are absorbed from the GIT by this process. The carrier molecules may be highly selective for the drug molecule, therefore, drugs of similar structure may compete for sites of adsorption on the carrier. That is, competitive inhibition is possible because only a certain amount of carrier is available. At times, all the adsorption site on the carrier may become saturated if the drug concentration gets very high. This process is further divided into the different following categories as primary active transport and secondary active transport. Primary active transport system is further categorized into the different categories such as ion transporters and ABC, means ATP binding cassettes. Students, now we first discuss about the primary active transport. This process involves direct requirement of the ATP molecules. The process is unipolar, that is, the process involves transfer of only one ions or molecules and is unidirectional. Carrier proteins which are involved in primary transport are further classified into the different categories as ion transporters. Students, now we first discuss about the ion transporters. As the name suggests, this process involves the transfer of ions across the cell membrane. Proton pump is a classic illustration of ATP operated ion pump that is used when acidification of intracellular compartment takes place. There are two types of ion transport which play a vital role in the intestinal absorption. First, organic anion transporter, and second, organic cation transporter. Organic ion transporter helps in the absorption of active components like atorvastatin and pravastatin. Organic cation transporter helps in the absorption of drug like diphenhydramine. Student, now we discuss about the ABC or ATP binding cassette transporters. Miniature foreign molecules such as drugs and toxins are primarily transported by this mechanism, mainly out of the cells, that is excretion, and hereby known as efflux pump. P-glycoprotein is a classic illustration of such type of transport mechanism. Now we discuss about the secondary active transport. In this transport, there is no direct involvement of ATP because this process takes place due to previously existing concentration gradient. This could be classified as figure number 6, and this figure number 6 is shown on a screen. Secondary active transport is further categorized into the two categories. This is known as Symport and Antiport. Student, first we discuss about the Symport or co-transport. This process employs the movement of both the molecules in the equal direction. For example, sodium ion glucose Symporter needs the potential energy of sodium concentration gradient to transport glucose against its concentration gradient. Student, now we discuss about the antiport, means counter transport. This process involves the movement of molecules in the adverse direction. For example, hydrogen ions are thrown out using the sodium ion gradient in the kidneys. Students, now we discuss about the paracellular or intracellular transport. This type of transport mechanism involves the transport of active component via the tight junction between the GI epithelial cells. This pathway involves a small number of drugs, so it is of less importance. The paracellular transport process has following two mechanisms. First, permeation, and second, persorption. Student, first we discuss about the permeation via tight junction of epithelial cells. This process takes place through the tight junction that are little wider than aqueous pores. Some examples of compound which are taken up by this mechanism are insulin and cardiac glycoside. Student, now we discuss about the second. This is the persorption. This process involves the non-permanent openings created by shading of two adjacent epithelial cells into the lumen through which the drug is permeated. Paracellular and port transport are different from each other due to the fact that the former involves movement of active component across epithelium via the cellular junction, whereas in the latter the molecules traverse into the cells via the pores that exist in the cell membrane. Student, Now we discuss about the vesicular or corpuscular transport, that is also known as the endocytosis. Like active transport, these processes also involve the use of energy but differs in the case that it transports substances within the vesicles into the cell, and this mechanism is shown on screen. The process can also be classified as transcellular since the mechanism involves transport across the cell membrane. Receptor-mediated endocytosis occurs when substrate bind to the specific membrane receptors. Substrates swallowed by cells in this way are stored in vesicles or they get degraded. Cellular uptake of immunoglobulin and low-density lipoprotein occurs when receptor-mediated endocytosis is involved. Vesicular transport can be further distinguished into two categories such as the pinocytosis and phagocytosis. Student, first we discuss about the pinocytosis, and this is also known as the cell drinking. Pinocytosis is a non-specific process whereby a substrate enters a cell by invagination to form an intracellular vesicles. Phagocytosis or cell eating. In phagocytosis, absorptive uptake of solid substances takes place. This process is accountable for the cellular uptake of macromolecular nutrients such as fats, vitamins, for example, vitamin A, D, E and K, starch and drugs, for example, insulin. Students, now we discuss next learning objective as absorption path that dominates drug absorption. There may be a number of mechanisms involved in the absorption of drug molecules from one region to another. The fastest route dominates the absorption of a particular compound. Mostly, passive diffusion is the main mechanism for absorption of many lipophilic compounds, whereas the carrier-mediated process governs the absorption of transporter substrate. In some cases, the paracellular junction is the route for the absorption of few small hydrophilic compounds with molecular weight less than 300 Daltons. Students, now we discuss about the post-absorption processes. After complete absorption of drug, it moves into the various processes such as drug distribution, protein binding, biotransformation and excretion. Students, classification of post-absorption processes is shown on screen. Students, first post-absorption process is distribution of drug. The term drug distribution is used frequently to include all processes that tend to lower the plasma concentration of drug as opposed to drug absorption which elevates the plasma level. The term distribution denotes the partitioning of a drug amongst the various regions where a drug may be contained within the body. Students, next post-absorption process is protein binding of drug. Drugs are frequently bound to plasma protein, especially with albumin, interstitial substances, intracellular constituent, bone and cartilage. If binding is strong, it will affect the distribution and excretion of drug in the body. A bound drug to a protein or any other macromolecules will not pass through the membrane in the bound form. Only the unbound form can move among the various compartments. Students, now we discuss about the next post-absorption process is biotransformation. Number of drugs are acted upon by enzyme in the body and transferred to metabolic derivatives called metabolites. The process of transformation is called biotransformation. Metabolites are generally more polar and less lipid soluble in comparison to parent drug because of the entry of oxygen into the molecule. Hydrolysis also produce highly polar group. Polarity also increases due to the conjugation with a highly polar substance. Due to this, metabolites often show less penetration into tissues and less renal tubular resorption in comparison to parent drug. This phenomenon is in accordance with the principle of the low penetration of polar and high penetration of lipid soluble substances. For same reasons, Metabolites, particularly conjugates, are usually less active in comparison to parent drug and often inactive. Even if they are appreciably active, they are generally excreted more rapidly. That's why the usual net effect of biotransformation can be said to be one of inactivation or detoxification. Students, now we discuss about the next post-absorption process is excretion. Kidney is the primary organ for excretion. Few drugs are excreted in bile, sweat, saliva or gastric juice or from the lungs. However, many lipophilic substances are reabsorbed after they are filtered through the glomerulus and thus come back into the bloodstream. This leads to inefficient elimination of the substance from the body. To make the elimination via the kidney more efficient, many substances are subjected to metabolic processes which render them more hydrophilic and therefore easier to eliminate. Students, now finally we summarize our topic as the process by which a compound penetrates one or more biological membranes to gain entry into the body is called absorption. Different route of administration like oral, transdermal, rectal, intramuscular, subcutaneous, nasal, inhalation, etc. are used for administration of active ingredient inside the body. The onset of drug action depends on the rate of drug absorption, like in case of intravenous injection, immediate and usually maximal pharmacological effect is seen, whereas slow onset is seen when drug is given by the oral route. There are number of factors affecting absorption of drug like the physicochemical properties of the drug, the biological factor and the factor related to the formulation development. Students, there are different mechanisms of absorption happened in GI tract such as passive transport, active transport, port transport and endocytosis, etc. After complete absorption of drug, they move into the various processes such as drug distribution, protein binding, biotransformation of drug and excretion. Thank you.